preach. My sermon topics come from the lessons that the disciple class is studying as we work our way through the Bible and through the Old Testament. Now, there's some problems with that. One of them is there's so much material there to cover in each lesson. Some of the lessons cover several hundred years of history in the life of Israel. And this week I'm sort of covering two lessons because we had a different topic last week. And so we're looking at the Israelites entering the Promised Land under Joshua, the time of Judges. After Moses' death, then Joshua became the leader of the Israelites. He led them into the Promised Land, and they began conquering the land. And of course, the first battle was the Battle of Jericho, and the walls came tumbling down, and you know the song, and you may remember the stories. And all of that happened about the year 1200 BC. But then from there, we go through the first three kings of Israel, ending with Solomon, is where the disciple class ends today. So that's 300 years. And there's just an awful lot of interesting stories, interesting characters, and you can't do justice to those. And to try to even pick and choose, it's a bit frustrating. And so I often try to do the big picture, but then when I do the big picture, you miss the flavor of the individuals and the stories. And so consequently, the second problem is it can get boring. Because just talking about history, some people like history. I do, but I have to keep reminding myself, not everybody's as excited about this as I am. And some people just plain get bored. But this is the continuing story of the Israelites and God's interaction with them and how God led His people and how He had a covenant with His people and how sometimes they were faithful and sometimes they weren't. I mean, that's the basics of the story as we go through it. So, this period, from the time they entered the Promised Land under Joshua until 300 years later, through the reign of Solomon, is really a transitional time. You know, they had been slaves in Egypt, then they were 40 years in the wilderness, and finally, after all the pessimists died off, God let them enter the Promised Land. And then they found themselves in a very hostile environment. And they knew that they, in order to conquer, they would depend on strong leadership. And all kinds of things happened. There were battles. And Joshua fit the Battle of Jericho and many other places. Some of this is hard reading, frankly, for me, because there's so much bloodshed. I don't like these war stories, and it just frankly seems out of character for God, at least the God we know through Jesus in the New Testament, and all of the killings and the slaughtering of entire groups of people and their livestock and everything in the cities, although part of the reason for that was because of their idols and the worship of those idols, and God was very intolerant of that and knew it needed to be wiped out. So, following Joshua, they're in the Promised Land now. They've conquered a lot of the territory, and then they were governed or ruled by people called judges. And these were kind of just charismatic leaders that rose up, or that God appointed coming from the various tribes. People God called out to lead, usually just in times of crisis or in a time when someone needed to call the people back to faithfulness. And some of those judges were rather unlikely characters, or we would see them as not the leaders we would suspect. For example, one was a woman, and that seems really rare in that time. Deborah, a prophetess whom people came to for advice and who sat and ruled and judged and also led the armies in battle against the Canaanites. Another one was Gideon, a man who seems unlikely because at the time God called him, he was hiding out thrashing grain in a wine press. because of the threat of the Midianites. And this angel came to him and said, I commission you, Gideon, to deliver Israel. And of course he said, well, I can't do that. My clan is the smallest and weakest in my tribe, and I am the weakest and smallest person in my clan. You got the wrong guy. Go somewhere else. But God persisted, as we know God does, as he did with Moses and perhaps has done with us, I suspect, from time to time. And Gideon still wasn't sure, so he put out a fleece to see if it would be wet or dry. Well, that's a whole nother story. But, and then God, in order to prove that he was the one leading this thing, reduced Gideon's army from the thousands that he had down to 300 troops to face all this Midianite army. And we don't have time for the details of that story, but with that small group, he sent the Midianites packing. There were others, people like Jephthah, who probably could be called the master of unintended consequences. He's the guy that won a victory in battle and promised God that whoever he saw first when he got back home, he would sacrifice that person to God. And his daughter, his only daughter, came out. Really a bad idea. Samson. He was kind of different. Samson was, the superhero, the strong guy, but he was really a poor judge of women. And women got him in a lot of trouble. And he was prone to poor decisions, to bad mistakes, and, well, anyway, he was a judge. And we wonder, why God called some of these people, what it was God really thinking with people like Jephthah and Samson in leadership. And if God really called them, why were they so ineffective? And we think, government today is not very effective at times. We talk about gridlock in Washington. We talk about all of that stuff. But there's a long history of ineffective or seemingly ineffective leadership. And that really is the theme through both of these lessons these 2 weeks. It's about leadership. Now, technically, the government of the Israelites was a theocracy. Theo meaning God. It was ruled by God directly. God was their king, and he governed. And the people appointed people like judges to kind of tell what God's will was as needed. But during that time, people were pretty content with their loose confederation of tribes. There were 12 different tribes. They each had their own territory. And they kind of did, whatever they needed to do. And they really, it seems, did not want a centralized power. Gideon, in fact, told the people in Judges 8:23, when they tried to make him their ultimate leader, I will not rule over you, and my son will not rule over you. The Lord will rule over you. He politely declined. And that system worked, I guess, reasonably well there for about 200 years. And leaders continued to emerge as they were needed. And they understood that God really was in charge, was their king. Actually, there are 2 different places here in the book of Judges, chapter 17 and chapter 21, where we find this same phrase. In those days, there was no king in Israel. All the people did what was right in their own eyes. Now, I'm not sure that's a good thing, but that's what they did. So their view of leadership was more like less is more. The less we have is better. What's the phrase that is sometimes used today? Some people want government so small that you could drown it in a bathtub. I think that's what they wanted. They wanted God in charge and just kind of leave us alone. But then things changed. There were external threats, terrorism, from the Philistines, a coastal people that kept raiding, and they never could completely defeat those Philistines. And the people began to feel a need for a Department of Homeland Security. And the shout went up, "We need a king. All of our neighbors have kings. Why can't we have a king like they do?" And that was the chapter that Sharon read this morning, where the people are wanting a king, and they're coming to Samuel, who was the judge at the time, and actually the last judge, and demanding a king. And so Samuel goes to God with that request, and God says, "Well, Samuel, you know this is a bad idea, but this is what the people want. And furthermore, Samuel, don't take this personally. They're not rejecting you, they're rejecting me." So God told Samuel to anoint a king, and he chose this tall guy, a guy named Saul, for king. And they should have known they had a problem when they were ready to do the coronation ceremony. They looked around and couldn't find Saul anywhere, and eventually found him, quote, hiding among the baggage. Now, is that a good model for leadership? Probably not. And that's a great little story. I think I preached a sermon on that once. But again, moving on, looking at the big picture, let's just say that Saul was somewhat unstable, that he had some real mental health issues. And so eventually God said, "Okay, Samuel, let's try again." And this time he sent Samuel to visit a man named Jesse, who had a whole bunch of sons. And the sons were brought out and paraded in front of Samuel. And each time God said, "Nope, that's not the one." And Samuel said, "Well, do you have any more sons anywhere?" "Well, there's a kid out taking care of the sheep. His name is David." And so they brought him. And God said, "That's the one." Samuel said, "Are you sure?" God said, "Well, you know, humans look on the outward appearance, but I look on the heart." And so David was made king. He started well. He was a great warrior. He was good looking. He had all of that charisma. He looked good on TV. I mean, he would be the perfect presidential candidate. But with success comes temptation. And then he had his, what we could call midlife crisis, and that unfortunate incident with Bathsheba. And he forgot who he was. And he forgot what he was called to be and to do, until he was confronted by Nathan the prophet, who looked him in the eye and said, "You are the man." And we have this psalm written by David that we used as our litany, where he acknowledged his sin, and he confessed his sin to God and asked for mercy and forgiveness. And it's an amazing psalm, this confession, this gut-wrenching honesty before God. But it also tells us about David's close relationship with God. David was a great king, the greatest king of Israel, it's generally considered. But he had some major flaws as well. But what he did have in his favor was this awesome intimacy with God, this close relationship, this connectedness. He wrote many of the Psalms, including this Psalm of Confession, Psalm 51. And he led Israel during a time that is after they had defeated all their enemies, and they were kind of the big dogs now, and it was a great time in the life of Israel, historically. Time of prestige and influence and power. And that was the reign of David, and then he was followed by his, what we could call, fortunate son, Solomon, who, after killing some rivals and consolidating his power, presided over a golden age, a time in which Israel was seen as strong and was envied by the entire world. But some of that began to slip away during Solomon's reign. And there's that phrase that power corrupts and absolute power corrupts absolutely. Well, that probably applies here. Solomon was noted for his wisdom, but he was also arrogant. He spent 7 years building a temple in Jerusalem, but then he spent 13 years building his own palace. God didn't like that. He had a lot of foreign wives, and they brought in their pagan religions with them. God didn't like that. He drifted. He drifted from God, so that by the end of his reign, the best days of the monarchy were over. And the nation of Israel would soon split into two, Israel and Judah. So here you have, in about 100 years' time, from the beginning of the reign of Saul through the time of Solomon, 3 kings. All of those warnings that Samuel had given the people pretty much came true. The kings that these people wanted so badly had brought Israel power and prestige and given them security from their enemies in a sense, but they also began to lead people away from God. And that's kind of where that story ends for this week. Now, since it's about leadership, leadership is an important issue. Godly leadership, wise leadership, is something that is always needed, but not always present. And, I was thinking about how does this apply today, and boy, there's a couple of situations this week. Yesterday, as Larry reported, we had a very long district conference, and our delegates can share more of that with you, and I'd be glad to as well. Sharon Poff was also there, and I think Randy was there in the afternoon for most of that. But, wow, our district is attempting to work through some really difficult issues, and I feel that we have had some excellent leaders in place with the leadership team and district executive minister, but it's taken its toll, frankly, on them. And John Jancy is on medical leave for a couple of months because of the stress of that. And so we need to pray, continue to pray for our district, for the Church of the Brethren, as we continue to work toward resolution of some of those things that deeply divide us. And pray for our district leadership team and for those who have been working and are continuing to work so hard on those issues. But I'm grateful for the leadership that we saw, even though some of the comments in the discussion are discouraging and disheartening. I'm glad I'm at Mountain View Fellowship and not in some other places. Well, as we speak about leadership and as we think about our own church, you know that Larry announced earlier that we are interviewing or have interviewed a person to help us here to share in our ministry, to make it hopefully more effective, more productive. And you're going to be getting more information next Sunday, and then the following Sunday, having that person to share in service and having a congregational meeting. So, new leadership opportunities for us as well. We pray for leaders. We pray for God to raise up leaders as they are needed. People who are after God's own heart. And indeed, it is essential. Leadership is essential in so many places, and in our church and in all churches, in our world and government and many other places. But it's important that we recognize wisdom, that we have discernment, and that we call and support those who can be effective and those who are persons after God's own heart. And we can learn from these stories, these Old Testament stories, some of the good, some of the bad. they had a lot of problems along the way with occasional bursts of glory and wisdom, but those folks were human. And yet when they followed God's leading, things went well for them. When they didn't go well. And I suspect we're going to find out more about that next week, because those are the lessons that follow as we begin to look at the prophets and how they warned the people that they were neglecting responsibility to God. So we'll leave it there for today.